address a number of topics. Um, Government frustration of rights on employees. You just heard about you to exercise your First Amendment right. I wanted to touch on this from the different perspective of government workers who routinely have had their rights frustrated and why they will want to engage in protests. As a matter of fact, when you're looking at public sector unions, one of the things, the main thing that they're given is an opportunity to exercise First Amendment rights because they're not allowed to strike. We'll get into. And then we'll talk about government immunity for torts, qualified immunity for civil rights, immunity for judges. Kind of it's just a whole, theme of government overreach, government interaction with us, leading to us to want to protest and strike against the government. Um, how many? Well, let me just start off before we get into this. There are almost 200,000 public sector workers in the state of Michigan, whether it's state employees, the employees of uh, all throughout all employees in the state, and so over a million when you look at across the country. And government laws will severely the right for public sector employees to engage in certain acts. The ability to strike is a limitation. The ability to negotiate over their health care costs is a limitation. And then finally, the ability, they are repeatedly attacked on I say Republican governors because that's not an NAACP note, that's a Richard Miller Cohen note, but that's what happens is that when you have governors who are in office across the country who, are sent to power, one of the main things they do, whether it's Rick Snyder here in Michigan, Scott Walker, Wisconsin, throughout the country, you'll see an attack on the rights of public sector workers to engage in activities. So the right to strike. Um, you've heard it, you've seen it. The UAW just went on strike against all three major auto manufacturers, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, at the same time for the first time in history. And as a result of that, they came away with record wins on wage increases, some significant benefit increases, and you're seeing strikes across the country just erupt at workplaces, all over. Unfortunately, for the almost 200,000 public sector workers in the state of Michigan, they don't have that right. And 38 states across the country prohibit public sector employees from striking. And so, if you think about the strike, it is literally the most impactful way for workers to galvanize and demand better working conditions, better pay, better benefits. Speaking of the First Amendment, for the last 200 years in this country, even before the law allowed for strikes, workers would be working in textile industries, would be working in whatever plants, or working in growing lettuce. And they would decide this workplace that you're in now is hopefully fairly safe. Not so much, a couple hundred years ago, even 100 years ago. And so what employees would do, 5 cents a day, until whatever the issue is. They exercise their 5 cents a day until whatever the issue is. They exercise their First Amendment right to come together and demand better working work. The most effective way for you to change your working condition is to gather together with your coworkers, and all of you demand it. Don't have the most effective tool to change their working conditions. So states actually, what public sector workers are left with is the First Amendment. So what public sector workers have to do, and again, you run across public, they're told, because you can't strike, you just have to tell the public how unfair conditions are for you. You have to tell the public in what's called, so if you're negotiating your pay package, so the way that this works is unions sit down with employer, whether the employer is the city of Detroit, county of Wayne, 36th District Court, whatever the employer is, the Detroit School Board, whatever the employer, Wayne County Community College, has a union. Whatever the employer is, you sit down with that employer and you're negotiating what our wages are going to be. We want 2%, 3%, 5% wage increases for the next year, whatever it is. And you make demands on that. And then the employer comes back and says, no, I'm only going to give you this. And you go back and forth. That's the negotiation process. So that can end if you're in the private sector. If you work for GM, Ford, Chrysler, wherever, that can end in a strike until the union or the workers get what they want. It ends in public sector saying, but I'm only going to give you 2. And so what public sector workers are left with is going to the public, going to the media, going to protests, going to the workers who were in the city of Detroit, cutting the grass, securing the buildings, and were taking so much cuts that they couldn't afford. Many of them were going to work full time. And to this day, I still remember talking to these people. Overseas, the workforce, they lose when 45 was elected, the federal sector unions lost the ability to meet on government property, which is where they always met. They lost their offices. They lost the ability to discuss things during work time. They lost basically the ability to function as a union outside of within the context environment. And so the constitutional right to free speech, the main thing that they do have, we talked about, then they go to the neutral decision maker. There are some, I want to touch on one piece, there are for just being disciplined, but being disciplined up to the level of district. So as a public sector, have the right to, and I think what Saida mentioned is I think it's a critical that if you go at a private sector, wherever not have an obligation to follow the First Amendment to give you the right to free speech. Public sector workers do. So we've had cases where public sector worker went to complain about dirty water in a river, and he was fired by county, and he got his he got a significant reward as a result of that, because he had a First Amendment right that was trampled on. So that's the one that was trampled on. So that's the one advantage that public sector workers have. It's the only way they have to really assert some influence in negotiating, and the one advantage they have is the constitutional right. Right to work. How many folk know what right to work is? This is a show of hands. Okay, a few of you. So basically, right to work means, and this is again on the context of government overreach. We're talking about how the government can come in and frustrate your rights that you have as a citizen in your day-to-day business. When you have a union, you elect that union to represent an entire group of workers. So all of the custodians, the majority, they all get together to vote. Do we want this union? Do we not? They have a vote. If the majority wins, they all win, right? So exclusive representative, which means that the union represents everyone. So they can have the custodian who hates the union, but custodians who don't like the union get those same 5% pay increases. So the way right to work is that there are laws across. So let's say your union says $50 a month. You want to be a member of this union, you're going to pay $50 a month to be a member. Now remember, you don't have to be a member, but you be required in a non-right to work state to pay what's called a service fee. So that service fee is less than 50. It may be vacation. They get Juneteenth off. They get these things for you. You pay those. You as a unit member, the staff rep. The union will have to pay an arbitrator It's like a hired judge, essentially, to hear whether or not you should have been. So the union's got to still represent you, still got to pay that arbitrator, but you've not been paying the nickel. And so basically working for free, the unions be working for free. As of last year, actually effectively early this year, it was repealed. It's the first state in the country, I think ever, and it's a different story. So Supreme Court, and again, elections matter. I'll take, again, this is Richard Mack talking, Democrat on the United States Supreme Court. As a result of that, there was a decision passed, the Janus decision, Janus, which basically said the unions, people who are working for the government, any government, cannot require any government, cannot require employees to pay anything. So if you think about it this way, unions, there's two main voices in our public square. You have the voice of the powerful, the overdog, who was called by Saida, who, you know, going to be demanding tax breaks, are going to be demanding lower regulations. They're going to be demanding everything they can to make sure their shareholders are going to receive profit. And then you have voices of the underdog. You have groups like the NAACP. You have unions. You have groups like ACLU and other groups who are raising money to get in that public square and fight for the least of these. Every opportunity that the overdog can take money from the underdog's pocket means that what? They got less competition. So when it comes to, are we going to use this money to give taxes away or give it that they can, when it comes to government, let's vote on the underdog side, influence the overdogs are going to have to get the money over. There's a campaign that's existed for decades to take money from overdogs, from NAACP, from unions, from other groups to make government. You ought to be petitioning folk in office to government. You ought to be petitioning folk in office to make sure that these things are made more fair. Laws like saying that unions couldn't collect dues out of paycheck deduction, but every other group, including corporate PACs, can do paycheck deduction, but not union PACs. Or laws limiting what unions can bargain about, or laws limiting what union members can be paid. So in state laws, there's literal limit on what employees can be paid. Who can even join a union? So there's all sorts of laws limiting that. One quick one, jump to government immunity, is a statute, PA 152. If you're in a public sector union in Michigan, even still today, we've got a Democrat-controlled House, Senate, Democrat governor, but this law has not yet changed. In Michigan, public employees, the group of public employees have to pay at least 20% of your health care costs. Now just think about that for a second. Most of you, if you have health care on the job, you're not paying the full freight of it. I can tell you that the average monthly premium for health care is anywhere from $1,200 to $1,500 for single coverage, all the way up to $2,000 plus for family and higher, right? Public sector workers have to pay 20% of that. So if I work, I'm only making $40,000 a year, $45,000 a year as a custodian. And I know that it's at least $1,000 for single overreach. The government doesn't allow us to sue it, even when it's wrong in many circumstances. A contract claim. So if you have a contract with the government, a contract claim. So if you have a contract with the government, where the government, and the government has agreed by contract to do certain things with you. You think of a contract, like a contract is like a mortgage, where it is a document where two sides agree, here's how we're going to govern ourselves, right? That's a contract. A law is something different. You don't have a contract to say, I'm going to walk on this sidewalk on government property, and if I trip and fall, the government's going to take care of me. That's not a contract. That's just whether or not you should receive um, recompense for your harm, for how you were harmed. But if you have a contract with the government, then the government can be upheld to something that is signed specifically for you. That's the way to look at it. A contract specifically for you, but laws are for everyone in general. Government agency is whether it's a state of Michigan, any of its departments, municipal subdivisions, counties, cities, school districts, community colleges, those are all arms of the government who are protected by this Government Tort Liability Act. Generally, governmental agencies are immune from tort liability if they are exercised in the discharge of a government function. So generally, you cannot, if the government is doing what it's supposed to be doing, in whatever government office, whether it's, I don't know why I keep talking about taxes, but if you're at the treasurer's office and the government office is supposed to be doing and insisting you paying taxes and it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, generally it's immune from being sued for torts. Now, a tort is slip and fall. A tort is emotional harm that you may receive because someone messed up on your tax bill, and now you're distraught because of how much harm you've had to suffer because of that. A tort is some harm that you've received. You can't sue the government for harm in many instances. Conditions in public buildings. If you are in a public building and there's something that causes you to hurt yourself, the government, but it's more related to the government, but it's more related to kind of like capital markets. The ownership or operation of the officer, number one, reasonably believes they're acting within the scope of their authority. Number two, the government is engaged in the exercise or discharge of a government function. And number three, the officer's conduct does not amount to gross negligence that is a proximate cause of the death or injury. So you see a lot of these terms, the essential, and you saw a lot about reasonable, like for instance, the right to produce your ID if it's reasonable, if there's reasonable suspicion of you committing a crime, you have to produce your ID. There's a lot of tests for reasonableness, but essentially, well, let's deal with this now and talk about that. What does it mean to be proximate cause? The Supreme Court has said, many of you may have heard Section 1983, where you bring claims against officers, and if you can, against the government. It's a higher bar. Actions depends on, based on the facts as alleged, would the constitutional right have been violated, and if so, was the alleged violation clearly established? And clearly establishing his constitutional right is sufficiently clear where an official would understand that their conduct violates the act. So basically, if George Floyd is alleging that what Derek Chauvin did to him, number one, violated his constitutional right, absolutely did. And number two, was that right so well known in society that Derek Chauvin, Officer Chauvin, should have known that putting my knee on his neck for more than 8 minutes is probably not legal. And so if you can argue that what happened to you violated my right and that the officer should have known that that right exists, then you can sue the officer for qualified immunity. Interestingly, just think about that. You have to prove not only that you had the right, but that the officer should have known about the right. Now, what's so amazing to me about that is I'm trying to think of another area of the law. If, ignorance of the law is no defense. That's, all of us lawyers, we all heard that. Ignorance of the law is no defense, except for qualified immunity. I mean, I'm trying to think of another area of the law where you can argue as an officer, yes, the law said I shouldn't have done it, but the law wasn't put in my training manuals. The law wasn't told to me by my boss. The law wasn't broadcast broadly. So I couldn't have known about that law. So even though your rights were violated, sorry about that, but because the law wasn't told to me, I can't be. That's literally what qualified immunity is. That's why it's such a dangerous doctrine. And again, there's